Before we start this show, please remember that none of this is financial advice.
Okay,
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have John Titus. John Titus has a channel called Best Evidence, and I'm one of his biggest fans. I really love his work. He really dives into central bankers and calls them out on the lies and deceit that they push out there. So welcome, John. John, thanks for coming back to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back, Darren. It's good to see you.
So the recent video that he has an Excel spreadsheet of all of the banks that are upside down right now. And he kind of goes into who's using this special vehicle that the Fed set up. The Fed set up basically a bailout for the banks. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate and just kind of tell us how you built the spreadsheet and like what you're seeing going on in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, let me say a couple things up front. It's not that the banks are upside down. If you look at the reports from the banks, their annual reports or their 10Qs, they all have positive equity. I was really looking at something else, but let me get to the second part, which is I did build a spreadsheet, and the way I built it, I started in March. Let me back up. I'll take another step back. In February, I did a video saying, look, there's a banking crisis going on right now. One of the things I pointed to was the vehicle that you're talking about, and it was not set up by the Fed. It's the Federal Home Loan Banks. It is very similar to the Fed in that it is privately owned, but it has a public benefit. So the Fed is privately owned, but they get to issue, basically Federal Reserve notes, the only legal tender in the U.S., but it's privately owned banks that are issuing those notes. There's 12 of them, the biggest one being in New York. The Federal Home Loan Board is different from the Fed, but it's similar. And the way it's similar is that they make loans. They'll go out in the private market and they'll borrow money at a low rate. And the reason they get such a low rate, they get one of the lowest rates in the country, is that there's a perception that the Federal Home Loan Banks it's a government agency when it really isn't. It's like the Fed. You have the name Fed in there, but you're not really part of the government. It's privately owned. And what the Federal Home Loan Banks do, and those banks are regional. There's 11 of them, so it's like the Fed again. It's like, well, there's 11 of you, and there's 12 Fed banks. But the 11 Federal Home Loan Banks, they borrow the money at a low rate, and they turn around and they lend it out at a higher rate. And one of their biggest borrowers over the last 30, originally it was set up this quasi-governmental entity. It's a GSE. It's a government-sponsored entity. It's sort of the redheaded stepchild of government-sponsored entities that no one really talks about. But they get to borrow money at a low rate because of the perception that they're public, and they really aren't. But they turn around and they lend money. They're supposed to lend it. The original mission was they were going to help homeowners. But like everything else, it starts out with good intentions and it gets corrupted by the powers that be, particularly the financial and monetary powers that be on Wall Street, corrupted. And now the biggest borrowers from the Federal Home Loan Banks are banks. They're commercial banks. The commercial banks borrow most heavily from the FHLB banks. And what you can see, if you look back through the last 3 or 4 financial crises, is you'll see that right before the crisis starts, one of the last canaries in the coal mine to come out of the coal mine before a crisis hits is a huge spike in borrowing from the Federal Home Loan Banks, meaning it's commercial banks that are in trouble and they're borrowing from the Federal Home Loan Banks. And the reason it's a problem when the commercial banks are borrowing from anybody really in sort of a panic situation like that is that the commercial banks are really the supply. They're the supply of our money in bank accounts. If you look at the money supply in the U.S., there's about $18 trillion sitting in U.S. bank accounts, and there's something like ballpark $2.4 trillion of Federal Reserve notes, and that's it. So the vast majority of U.S. money is sitting in bank accounts, and in commercial bank accounts. And so when banks get into trouble and they start to panic and borrow from the Federal Home Loan Banks, it's a sign there's going to be a crisis. So there was panic borrowing in 2000, right in the dot-com bust. There was panic borrowing in 2008, which led to obvious problems. There was panic borrowing right before the repo market started to blow up in 2019. And there's panic borrowing really in the fourth quarter of 2022. And I point this out in a video I released in February. And I said, look, there's a banking crisis going on right now. You can see that these banks are having a liquidity problem because of this panic borrowing from the Federal Home Loan Banks. And sure enough, 3 weeks after I put that video out, Silicon Valley Bank fails, Signature Bank fails, and First Republic fails, and they go down. And so, yeah, that the crisis I was talking about came to fruition. And in all three cases, all three of those banks, indeed, they were heavily borrowing from the FHLB, from the Federal Home Loan Banks. There was panic borrowing. So I was talking about panic borrowing on the aggregate scale. I was looking at Fed data. But the three banks that failed, they were all panic borrowing from the FHLB too. And so I put together this spreadsheet with that as a starting point. Like, I know that panic borrowing, the big spike in borrowing by any bank from the Federal Home Loan Board is a sign of trouble. But there must be other signs of trouble too, that would tip off people so that they can. There's nothing you can do about Signature or Silicon Valley Bank now, and the horse is out of the barn, right? But there must be other things you can look at other than panic borrowing from the FHLB to sort of tip a person off to, like, maybe is my bank in trouble? And so I started building this spreadsheet, and it took me a long time. I'm going through a lot of data, and I'm picking off the data from the FDIC website and other publicly available websites. I didn't use any sort of premium websites or any pay websites. I used all publicly available data, and I put it into a spreadsheet. And when I started to really parse through the data, and when I started to think about, well, what led to this? What really caused this? I realized, wait a minute, I should be looking at really huge bank accounts, because with some of the testimony that came out in the wake of the Silicon Valley Bank failure, my jaw hit the floor. There was testimony to the effect after Silicon Valley Bank failed in the Senate that $42 billion left that bank in 6 hours. And that's a huge red flag, because really that's a lot of scratch to leave a bank in 6 hours. I mean, that's a fatal wound, basically. You've just bled out in the course of 6 hours. And I'm like, the only way that much money can leave a bank in 6 hours. The media is trying to say, oh, it's people on apps. That's a bunch of nonsense. That's not apps. That's a few huge accounts all leaving in lockstep. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. And so I started to look and constructing the spreadsheet. You can check online. One of the things you can check is you can't find like how many people at the bank have, say, $10 million in the bank account. But one of the things you can check is how much money in that bank is uninsured. How many deposits are uninsured out of the total? And sure enough, when I started to look at Silicon Valley Bank and the banks that have failed, they all had really high proportions of bank accounts north of $250,000. $250,000 is as much money as you can have and have it insured. Once you go to 250,001, that next dollar is not insured. And all three of those banks, if you ranked the banks, if you've just looked at the top, say, 35 banks in the U.S. ranked by assets, okay, and you ranked them out, JP Morgan would be number one with $2.4 trillion. And those three banks would all be in the top 34. They're all really big banks. The media is trying to tell you, oh, it's regional banks, it's small banks. No. These are huge banks that failed. All three of them are in the top 35. And if you rank the top 35 banks, not by assets, but you rank them by the percentage of accounts north of $250,000, those three banks that failed come in at 1, 2, and 3. And it was like, bingo, this crisis was caused by the Federal Reserve, and it was caused by having whale depositors on account at these banks, and they're leaving all at once. And so the video was called Deep Diving the Fed's Killer Whale Crisis, because the killer whale refers to somebody with say $1 billion in their bank, that they leave, if that bank leaves, or if that customer leaves a bank, leaves Silicon Valley Bank and say goes to Citigroup, Silicon Valley Bank has to transfer $1 billion of reserves to Citigroup. And that's just how that system works. And so I did that video, and those are the two big things. So it's panic borrowing from the FHLB, and it's huge bank deposits on account at the banks. That's what's driving the crisis.
So Peter Thiel wrote a letter. Everybody that was in his email group wrote a letter to the VCs that are the whales. And what happened was, after he wrote that letter, some of these guys went onto social media. At Jason is one of the guys, and said everybody should be terrified, panic, and like there is a buzz around VCs telling everybody on social media to be scared right now because Silicon Valley Bank is failing, banks are failing. But still, even if you move the whale accounts from a smaller bank to a larger bank, the fundamental problem is still there, because it's a problem from the get-go. Fractional reserve banking, right? It's a problem from the beginning. So everybody that's using these FHLBs, those are from the Great Depression, I believe, right? They were from the Great Depression, set up to help Main Street, and now they're going behind the scenes, borrowing from the FHLB banks, and pretty much it's a liquidity line. So the Fed and government stepped in and put a floor underneath this, and pretty much said, we're going to insure everybody and make everybody whole. But there's still the problems here. And if you keep going down the line, right, like Silicon Valley Bank must owe another bank money, and they must owe another bank money. So somebody, is taking a hit here, and it keeps going down the line. You have to assume that this is going to continue to some degree. In your spreadsheet, you could see that some of the numbers are like in the red, and some of the numbers are borrowing lots of money from the FHLBs. Do you have anything to add with just the borrowing? HSBC was one of the bigger ones that I noticed. State Street, BNY Mellon. So the guy from Circle, Jeremy Allaire from Circle, he had all of his money parked in Silicon Valley Bank and then moved it to BNY Mellon. So after he got the email from Thiel, that's when he started to move the cash deposits from Silicon Valley Bank to BNY Mellon or State Street, which are kind of like crypto-friendly banks. So that email tipped off a lot of the whales to start moving their money. And then once they did, then the chaos broke out. But you still have these problems, right? Like nothing's really fixed. They just kind of set up a small.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that is completely right. The problem isn't fixed. It's just a shell game. It's just moved from one shell to another. The problem is that when the pandemic hits, and the Fed uses the pandemic as an excuse to ramp up $4.5 trillion in asset purchases, it purchased those assets from non-banks, and that led to the creation of $4.5 trillion in new deposits. Now, to do that on the scale you're talking about, $4.5 trillion, you're not going out and buying assets from mom and pop. You're buying assets from dudes with a lot of money and from institutions with a lot of money. And that's who has the big bank accounts. And these bank accounts are huge. And the big mystery in all of this that no one talks about, I find this really fascinating, that even people in the alt media space don't talk about this, is what are people doing with $1 billion in a bank account, knowing full well that's uninsured? I mean, I could see somebody having $1 billion in a bank account for maybe a day or a week to sort of dot I's and cross T's and get your ducks in a row somewhere else. But these accounts, they've been on account for 3 years. Who does that? I mean, because the risk is the bank fails and you're out the money. It's almost if the whole thing looks like a takedown to me. And it looks like the people who have those big accounts knew all along that those accounts would be made whole regardless of what happened. It's this thing has an aroma of insider cronyism that's absolutely overpowering. And but we get back to what you just said. The problem hasn't gone away. And the reason the problem hadn't gone away is deposits are still huge. I mean, the US bank deposits have declined maybe $900 billion. But hell, I mean, going into the pandemic, the total amount of bank accounts of money on deposit in the US was 13.5 trillion, and it went up to about 18.5. Now it may be down to about 17.5, but you're still way over the watermark, and you still have these whale accounts out there. And like you say, they can leave at any time. If they can leave Silicon Valley Bank, they can leave JP Morgan Chase too. Now, it's going to take a lot more of them to take a bigger bank down, but the problem has only been diffused to the extent that the bank is bigger than Silicon Valley Bank. The problem is very much still out there. Moreover, I'll add this to what you said. We have another quarter of data. The data from the FHLB banks comes out and it shows up in the FDIC. The FDIC releases its data quarterly, but we have another quarter of data. And when you look at FHLB borrowing from the most recently available quarter, you start to see names like, I don't even want to think about what would happen if, for example, Charles Schwab Bank went down. And Charles Schwab Bank has just went hog wild borrowing from the FHLB during the last reported quarter from the FDIC. And it's not the only one. There are plenty of others out there. Moody's downgraded a bunch of, Moody's or Fitch downgraded 10 or so banks recently. And I was shocked that Schwab wasn't on the list and Comerica Bank wasn't on the list. A bunch of other banks are on the list, but those two aren't. And there's a lot of banks that are still in trouble. God forbid something happens in the fall and some of these bigger banks go down. It could create a real problem of confidence if it's a name bank. Like the banks, if you look at the banks that Moody's downgrades or Fitch, whoever it was, they've got names like Prosperity and Pinnacle and BOK Financial, and they're big banks. I mean, if you follow the banking industry, those are $40 billion and up banks. I mean, they're in the top 100 for sure. But the media can pitch that as a small and mid-sized bank, and the ordinary reader is not going to know any different. They'll think, yeah, that's a small and mid-sized bank. They're trying to sell this as a small to mid-sized bank crisis, and it's not. It's not. Right. What's happening is the top 100 banks that aren't in a too big to fail category are being rolled up into the JP Morgan Chases, the Bank of Americas, and the Citigroups.
Right, but even just treasuries, right? If you, like you said, who parks $1 billion at a bank account, and now you're having a U.S. debt downgrade, right? So that's spiking yields. And usually, if I was an institutional guy and I was supposed to manage money, I'm not going to keep cash in the bank. It gets me 0% interest rate. I'm going to roll it over to CDs. I'm going to roll it into treasuries. I'm going to roll it into something that earns a yield. And right now, treasuries are, 5% riskless, right? So the banks have everything to worry about, and, they have to back all the assets that come in, right? So they take on bank accounts, and they have to back those with treasuries or commercial mortgage-backed securities. And, there's every incentive for whales to leave and really no incentive for them to stay other than the risk of the markets. You have the risk of the treasury failing, right? Now you went from AAA to a AA plus. So what are your thoughts about the moving into treasury?
If the treasury, I would still move the money into treasury. Let me put it this way. If the U.S. government fails, you've got some man-sized problems that you got to worry about that aren't your money. Are you going to survive? That's a huge problem. If the U.S. government collapses, you better watch out. I mean, that's a real problem because the U.S. government, the U.S., like any nation, it has a sovereign right. It has a sovereign right to issue money. I mean, that's just a foundational. In the U.S., it appears in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The issuance of money, was parsed out to Congress. It's issued in our country by the Treasury. So the Treasury downgrade, yeah, I kind of get it. I understand it because I understand the impetus for the downgrade. And the impetus is this. The U.S. is now, the fundamental flaw in the U.S. system is that it borrows its money into existence. And that's a fatal flaw. And now, as a consequence of that fatal flaw, you can get away with that for a long time, as long as you're productive. And then, time goes on, and the parasite class, the financial class gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And now we're at a situation where the U.S. is borrowing basically to make the interest payment. I mean, the interest cost every year, part of the budget is north of $1 trillion. And that's really the motivation behind the downgrade. Because it's like, well, I mean, if you're borrowing your money to make the interest payment, it's all over, and that's the impetus for the downgrade. But the point of the underlying point that you started with is you're still better off in treasuries, if for no other reason than the treasury is insured. You're insured 100% on the treasury, and you're not on the bank. The bank fails. You lose everything. If the treasury fails, it's because the government fails, and you've lost everything anyway. Do you follow me?
Yeah, but the downgrade spiked the yield on the treasury. So that's what I'm saying. the whales have every incentive to get out of the banks. And why would you want to keep liquidity right now unless you were looking to buy something, right? Unless I was looking to go from liquid to buying something. That's the only reason why I would keep my money in the bank. So unless they thought the
Right.
stock market was going to crash or something like that, and they have money on the sidelines to buy the dip, there's no incentive to have your money in the bank. They're not giving you interest.
I agree. I mean, and I'm amazed every week I check the bank accounts. I go on the Fed website and I look how much your bank deposits this week, and I'm waiting for the day where it just really starts to go down, and it's like it doesn't go down that much. It's like, what is wrong with you? Not understand that your money is uninsured north of 250,000? What don't you understand about that?
Well, I think because, like you said earlier, that they're just assuming that the government's going to come in and just bail them out. I mean, I honestly would assume that too, because they did. They came in and bailed everyone out, right? That's the only explanation for why money isn't moving. And I mean,
Right.
with the sidelined part of this too, I think a lot of people are waiting for an opportunity to move into something, so they're just sitting in the banks, not realizing that the banks themselves are a threat. And they don't,
Right. And not realizing that it's a closed circuit system. So yeah, you move your money into stocks, but your dealer, they have a bank account too. The money never leaves this. It doesn't leave the system until people move out and they move into treasuries, right? Or they move into something that's back. They really got to move into treasuries to reduce the money supply, because otherwise it's just a game of whack-a-mole. Yeah, you whack them all here, but it pops up over there, right? I mean, you got to look at the aggregate supply of money, and it's massive. The Fed ballooned that up during the pandemic, and it never really looked back. Yeah, it's ramping down slowly, but how did that go in 2019?
Right. And to your point, there's clips of Larry Fink talking about we have 5,000 banks in the United States. It would be good to kind of concentrate them down. They're kind of talking their books to push up the whole getting your money out of the regional banks and into the bigger banks. But the bigger banks, even with the regulations that they have, it's not much better, right? It's like the difference between 8% to 10% collateralized. They're not really a better position if you were to go to a bigger bank. So the underlying.
Plus you're embracing the risk that they're just going to rip you off with total impunity, because they have a history of doing that.
Right. And outside of the government stepping in and making everybody whole. Yeah. At that point, though,
HSBC gets caught red-handed instructing drug dealers on how to fit the cash in these little, birdhouses so they can make the deposits. Does anybody at HSBC go to jail? No. HSBC paid a fine that was negotiated and agreed to by HSBC. It's a racket, these big banks. And HSBC, that's a foreign version of a too big to fail bank. I mean, there's a list. The BIS actually maintains a list of about 30 what they call global GSIBs, global systemically important bank. HSBC's on that list, and all the big ones in the U.S. are on the list. JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America on the retail side, and then sort of on the investment bank side, even though they're commercial banks, you have Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. I mean, these are too big to fail banks. There's a list of banks that are basically above the law. You could look at it. Why would you bank with somebody who's above the law? Well, what's to prevent them from robbing you blind? I remember dating a bartender in New York City, and she banked at Bank of America. I said, "You're out of your mind," because she was depositing huge cash deposits from tips into her bank. And I said, "This is not good." And sure enough, she calls me up one day. She's crying, $1,200. She had the receipt. She had the counter receipt saying she deposited $1,200. The Bank of America was like, "Nope, never got it. Don't know what you're talking about."
Wow. I mean, so you brought up HSBC. That's part of like the whole euro dollar market. Are you familiar with like Jeff Snyder's work on the euro dollar market, talking about the dollar's utility is kind of critical, and right now we're pretty much at a point where they have to print. There's no other choices. Like they have to print, and the euro dollar market is kind of pointing in that direction. Well, is pointing in that direction. The euro dollar curve is pointing in that direction.
Well, I'm not really. The euro dollar to me is kind of it's a mythical thing because the banks in Europe that lend in U.S. dollars, that's really a U.S. loan. It's U.S. money because all those banks that lend in U.S. dollars that are overseas, they have a correspondent bank in the U.S. It's smoke and mirrors. That money really isn't lent by the U.S. It's not lent in Europe. It's really lent in the U.S. It's created in the U.S. It's maintained in the U.S. It shows up as a ledger entry in Europe, but it's not really there. So the reason he's right, but not for I don't think the right reason. The reason there's no way out but printing is what I talked about earlier, which is you now have a situation where your tax revenue in the U.S., aggregate tax revenue for a year is less than your interest payments plus your non-negotiable payments like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. If you add up those four things, they're bigger than your tax base, which means you're now in a situation where you're borrowing to make an interest payment. And the classic way out of that situation is you just keep borrowing willy-nilly, which means in a debt-based monetary system, you keep printing willy-nilly. That's why they're in trouble. It really has nothing to do with, there's no locus to it. It's all U.S. based. Right. I mean, in my opinion.
And at the same time, we keep spending more money at home, right? Like we're giving out aid, we're giving out money for every single thing you could think of, and the monetary policy is tight, but the government hasn't stopped spending. And Larry Fink estimates that only 5% of that policy is actually entered into the economy, and if only 5% came in, and you look at grocery prices, CPI is completely way off because my bill is now triple. It's at least double to triple. It's not 6%. That's a silly. That indicator is totally useless now. I don't even look at it.
Yeah, right. CPI. It's absolutely useless. It's just a pile of misinformation. Basically, like everything else, like the entire media. I mean, that was sort of the impetus for doing my channels. Like, I can't trust any of you guys. I can't trust you farther than I can. I can throw a few of you down a staircase, but I can't trust you. So the only way to do it is to actually go to one of the reasons you trust financial data is that it's a double entry accounting. So one person's debt is another person's assets, and people in the financial industry, they tend to be really good at keeping score. So if the Fed reports something, it's sort of an inherent checks and balance system. Those numbers typically add up. But the numbers from the BLS and the CPI and the unemployment rate and the labor force, you left me a long time ago.
I'm definitely seeing the signs. More homeless people walking around. More food prices becoming out of control.
More people with signs at intersections on the interstate. You look around. I mean, what happened to the police, right? I mean, I've noticed this for years. We're the cops. It used to be, if the cops be around, they'd be pulling people over, speeding. Yeah, you see that on the interstates, but in the cities, not so much anymore. Very, very rarely. They'll show up to an accident, but it's got to be a severe problem. There's all sorts of signs of budgetary trouble in municipalities and in state governments, and it's all due to the money's been sucked up. It's been basically sucked up and hoovered up out of the productive class in the U.S. to the bankers, and this is borne out in the data from the Fed. I mean, if you look at the Fed now tracks the top 0.1% of households, and you can look at the top 0.1% of household, their checkable deposits, they went up crazy. Everybody else's went up, but not that much. And some of them, the bottom half has started to go back down. It's like the rich are getting way richer, and everyone else, one way or another, or sooner or later, is getting the shaft.
Well, the credit card delinquency payments are shooting up, right? The smaller guy is getting beat up right now, while the wealthy are sitting on cash, wondering what to invest in. They have no safe places to go. And that's how the economy works, right? The wealthy person invests in something, gives people jobs and opportunities, and they make careers and start using the wealth the wealthy person invested. Now everybody's sitting on the sidelines. So
yeah, but the problem, I mean, I don't have a problem with people being productive and making money. I do have a problem with you making so much that you're now above the law, like some of these banks are, and your so-called enterprise is ripping off and perpetrating fraud, stealing people's houses, stealing people's pension funds. And that's how a lot of people are getting wealthy now, and nothing's being done about it because the law enforcement mechanism has been broken, and it's been broken for a solid 10 years. I mean, where the government, the DOJ, the Department of Justice itself will come out and tell you this bank basically, in so many words, is too big to jail.
Right. And I know the article that you mentioned earlier about HSBC. There's another one that was Credit Suisse. That was the other one that just failed. That apparently was teaching people how to evade taxes, do all these different types of things. It only comes out after they fail, right? But during that entire time, they kept getting fined and everything. They were kind of responsible for a lot of people hiding out and pushing their drug money through credit.
And what happens? And the perpetrators get swept up into UBS, which is what Credit Suisse got rolled into UBS, which is already a globally systemically important bank itself. And the perpetrators have the same job. The only people really who lose their jobs are the people at Credit Suisse who are redundant with their equivalents at UBS. But the people who are perpetrating the crimes, no, they're getting promotions. It's crazy.
Right. They're going to get a promotion from all of this. So I noticed Kissinger, Yellen, a couple other bigwigs, Blinken, and John Kerry all went to China. And kind of if you follow the 2008 timeline, right, what happened was China stepped in at one point and helped with the 2008 financial crisis by buying treasuries and buying assets and kind of like helping out in that situation. But China's been going the opposite way. They've moved with the BRICS nations. They're moving in the opposite way. They don't want to touch dollars and treasuries anymore. So our toxic debt no longer has the demand that it used to have. So you have to wonder when this actually shows up in the markets, who's going to be there to try to absorb some of the shock. And
who do you think? It's going to be the Fed. I mean, they've been doing it for years. They really started in earnest in 2008. But you're right, China. I mean, I think China owns less than $1 trillion of treasuries. Last I checked. Well, everybody thinks that China owns all this debt. It's like, well, they own a lot, but they're not a big one. They're not near the top.
They've been de-risking. If you look at a chart of China's debt, they've been de-risking it and putting it into precious metals. Same thing with Russia, right? Russia was sanctioned in 2014. They were stockpiling gold. Anyone in Russia, like everybody knew that was coming. What happened, right? They knew that they were going to get sanctioned. We're preparing for that exact situation. So the same thing has happened with China and the BRICS nations, really. So right now, we're teetering on this edge of crisis, and we really don't have the same dynamics at play. We have a different dynamic at play, and it's going to be the Fed that buys everything and pushes inflation up. And then that starts the spiral into super high prices. And then at that point, it's the Great Reset, right?
I think that's a much more realistic scenario that you just outlined with the increasing inflation than a collapse. I mean, I don't see a system-wide collapse right now, even as bad as U.S. is, paying people not to work and all the rest. And we don't have to go through the litany or the catalog of problems. As bad as it is, you still are left with a situation where something like 55% of the world's assets are denominated in U.S. dollars. I mean, that's not going to go away overnight. You can deflate that, kind of let that air out of that balloon, but that's a big ass balloon, man. That's going to take a long time to get the air out of that guy. So I don't see that. I see what you're talking about, which is, the devaluation is a different matter. That inflation can go on for a long time, and the cancer of inflation is what's going to eat you away. Not a 2x4 to the back of the head. I don't see that coming. I see what you're talking about, which is the erosion of value through inflation and through more monetization of the debt by the Fed. That's your real problem. I think you're right about that.
And if you look at charts, gold compared to any other currency, it's past all-time high, except for U.S. dollar. So I was just watching Jim Rickards' interview where he's talking about the BRICS nation pegging their currency to a certain denomination of gold, and then having the Fed actually have to buy gold in order to pay. And at that point, they would push up the dollar value of gold. So it's kind of like a chess game that he kind of outlined.
I don't, I would expect, I know you follow crypto really well. You do a great job covering it. I always thought, well, it's just a matter of time before the Fed tokenizes gold, right? But they never did it. I'm like, I don't know. So I tell you what, Darren, when it comes to gold and the Fed, from where I sit, I mean, I wouldn't touch that bet with my worst enemy's hands. You know what I mean? It's just like, I
am seeing a ton of talk about tokenization. Let me go back to Larry Fink. He said that the debt market is undergoing a transformation of tokenization, right? So he's talking about tokenizing the entire debt market. So that's the core of the markets is debt. And how are you going to tokenize something? That's where crypto fits in. And in order for it to be trustless, that's what a crypto asset is, right? Those are the coins that are on CoinMarketCap, or the trustless ones. The ones that have normally been used in the past have been these permissioned private systems that only BlackRock can trust, only JP Morgan can trust, right? Only these silos of banks can trust. Banks don't trust each other. That's the problem, is there needs to be some type of middle ground. And that's where all this fits in my head, is the tokenization part. What I listen to everybody and they always point to gold as well. And I see the opportunity with crypto because it's something that is trustless. I don't have to trust a bank. You're talking about double entry accounting. Crypto's triple entry accounting, except for the third person is a direct democracy of people, of checks and balances. So the third person is auditing every single thing that happens and making sure that happens, but it's really just a group of people that run software to make that happen. So, that's where I really see crypto playing in, and everybody's missing it. And it's kind of like, that's why I made my channels. Like, you guys are all missing it. You're thinking gold, but it's really natural resources. It's really good. It's really GDP, right? That's the things that are going to yeah, and that's where I really see all this stuff headed.
That's really interesting, because I recently have started to read and try to get my head around crypto and really try to come to some understanding of it. And I'm motivated by the fact that the central banks and the Fed in particular are so interested, and it's a borderline obsession with crypto. And I'm trying to understand it. And now that I get more into it and start looking at the problems of the commercial banking system, I'm starting to understand that wherever they want to go, whatever kind of control system they want to implement, they're looking at commercial banks and they're seeing a system that's it's held together. It's not the smooth, efficient, lossless system that you might think it is. There's a lot of post-it notes being passed, and people manually making entries in spreadsheets. That's why the system is so slow. And so that's not the system of control the Fed is after. And I suspect that one of their interests in crypto is what you're talking about. It's we don't have to trust people. We've got a system here. And the Fed wants to know, how can we work that system to our advantage? And if you look, the St. Louis Federal Reserve publishes Jerome Powell's calendar. They publish his monthly calendar. There's a couple month delay with it, but you can look at his calendar every month and see who he meets with. And one of the people he meets with, without fail, every month, between 30 minutes and an hour, is Augustin Carstens. I mean, I swear to you, he meets with Carstens for more than he does with Janet Yellen. I would bet dollars of donuts on that prop. And I'm convinced that Carstens, he's all over CBDC and everything else. That's where I think the Fed and the central banks, I think they're trying to get away from commercial banks, to be blunt.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense to me. And a lot of banks in general could just be replaced with smart contracts. A lot of the functions of a bank can be replaced just with a smart contract, a smart escrow, whatever. Those things could just be programmable language in value. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bank, but if they did have a direct relationship, so the there was the Digital Dollar Project, which is a thing that's a lobbyist organization that's trying to lobby the Fed to do a digital dollar in the right way with privacy and Western values attached to it. They proposed an idea that had a bunch of different Ripple net partners. And that's kind of why I've been following XRP and Ripple so closely, is because they have those heads that went from the BIS or the Fed right to Ripple, right? And it's like this revolving door of IMF, BIS heads right back to their company. And this digital dollar project outlined Western Union and a small Philippine bank called BDO Bank. BDO Bank is tiny, like microscopic, yet they're a RippleNet partner, and they're plugged into a network of systems that are all over the Middle East, all over Indonesia, all over Asia. And once you have access to that system, so you pick this small, tiny remittance company, once you have access to that system, you have access to the Middle East wealth and to Asia's wealth. So that's what I'm thinking is that, and the way they describe the digital dollar, how it's designed, they talk about having a ledger built right into it. And they use the term DEX. They didn't use a centralized exchange. They use the term decentralized exchange. The XRP ledger is a coin that has a DEX built into it. So they put a instance or the XRP ledger in the middle of this, and then Western Union and BDO Bank, they set up a liquidity pool, and they're able to swap tokens back and forth. And if you're green lighted, if you get your identity checked off, then you're allowed to use that pool of liquidity. So and that's kind of like where they're headed with all of this stuff. You mentioned IDs before, digital IDs, or I did. I forget who mentioned it, but I was talking to technologists. I was talking about like Facebook. When you log into Facebook, now you can log into anything. You can log into any website through Google or through Facebook. These big tech companies already have your digital identity done. And that's fighting the government again. So not only is the government fighting the private sector with money, with CBDC's crypto, but also with identity management. So the big techs have already came up with a digital identity system. Really, the government could just, use their system, which they do. They've partnered with Google and Facebook and all these places.
They partner with Google. They created Google.
Right.
The notion that these guys like Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are independent of the government is just risible to me. It's like, are you kidding me? Did you fall off a turnip truck?
Right. Me too. I mean, like Musk presenting X right now, it's WeChat Alipay, but for the Western world, right? He's applying for all these different licenses to be money transmitters and trade equities and stocks, but he's really emulating what WeChat and Alipay are doing. And but according to people that live in China,
so I'm interested in what you're saying about this XRP, but in where they're headed. But to me, the 64 trillion, well, it's actually an $18 trillion question, is how do you deal with 18 trillion US dollars sitting in commercial bank accounts? That's where people have their money. How does that get parlayed to or interact with, the eventual sort of, let's say, just call it a crypto system? That's the part I don't get, and what I'm kind of trying to understand as I read more and more.
Well, I mean, there's no like direct lines. These are all kind of like dotted lines, right? So you see the board members, people moving around. Some of the theories, right, would be that the tokenized debt serves as stable coins, right? You take debt, and now that's no longer sitting around. That's a medium of exchange that we can use as money. So debt now becomes a token that I can swap back and forth, and that's what backs a stable coin, is tokenized debt. So you turn this entire tokenized world into a crypto world, not to mention there's all these people in the world that don't have bank accounts. You bring them onto the system. You bring, half the people in the world don't have bank accounts. You bring everybody into the system, and now you're able to get natural resources with people that aren't banks. So the people that are cut off from the banking system right now, you have access to that, and you're able to bring in those people into the banking system, not to mention intangible things like data and carbon credits, stuff like that, right? all that stuff gets tokenized, and now you're creating wealth out of thin air, so to speak, right? Like carbon credits, you can create these systems and data, right?
Creating a tax out of thin air, yeah.
Yeah, it's an intrinsic. It's not. There's nothing there with data, right? Like data is my data footprint. If I'm able to monetize something like that, that's value created, and
yeah,
that's a market that I can now use as something. So, to answer your question, there's no definitive proof or anything like that. It's just you see the same characters moving back and forth, and I think a lot of people are just missing the trustless third-party accounting part. Yeah. That solves a lot of these problems that are.
That part I get. When I'm interested in sort of the physics part of it, which is you have a weight over here that's $18 trillion, and you've got a system here. How do you shift that weight into this new system? That's the part I'm like, how does that work? And I don't get it. And I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying that's what I'm trying to come to an understanding of.
My thing is like, what is money, right? It's a measurement of goods and services. It's a measurement of natural resources. So if we were able to bring in more natural resources, make the system more efficient, we could drive down prices of everything, right? And that would be deflationary. So if we make it a really efficient system, now we have a deflationary system, and they can just keep printing more. I mean, Eventually, the printing press comes to an end, whether it's a CBDC, a token, whatever. Somebody loses confidence at one point, but I guarantee you they can kick the can down the road longer than people think with tokenized assets. If we were able to replace all these middlemen and give that value back to you, all the value that these banks suck up, if we gave that back to you, your pocketbook would look a little bit better. Your wallet.
It would be a radical and very positive change, basically not only in the US, but really everywhere. I mean, that the value part I totally get, because in the debt-based monetary system, there's a built-in skim. And I think we're sort of at the end of the road with how much has been skimmed off. It's too much. And so, the wealth that in a redistribution without any skim would be so massive. Everybody's standard of living would basically double overnight. But the skimmers, they're not interested in that. And the skimmers, I got news for you, they got a lot of power. So how the system ends up looking, you got to keep in mind, you got to factor in the skimmers are going to have a big influence on how the ultimate system works. As a practical matter, they're going to be involved. I mean, the fact that Larry Fink is talking about tokenization, that's the most horrifying thing I've heard this year.
Have you noticed how many people from banking are going into the crypto industry? And they're going in droves, coming in droves, leaving the banking industry, jumping ship from banking to crypto. So I don't have all of the answers, but I do see the trend, and that's kind of what I'm following. And all these different pilots and projects that are being set up. There's the same players involved with all of them. So
here's another question that I have, and I think I know the answer to this. I'd be interested in your answer. Can you effect or pull off a transition like you're talking about without a massive banking crisis or financial crisis, here in the U.S.?
It would be a great excuse to the crisis would be a great excuse to implement the technology, right? If we would. And I gave you a stable coin or a CBDC and said, here's some money. And, you go out and use it because we have a problem. And, this is going to help the country. You get everyone behind it. You get everyone happy about it. What I'm really surprised with is actual people are like talking about this stuff in the public. Like politicians, I would never think would be making anti-CBDC statements, right? Like it just didn't make sense to me years ago, but now I'm seeing it right in front of my face, right? And like people keep doing it. So I think that's going to be, cyber crisis, and then they have a system for you to use that's cyber resilient and can't be hacked. It's built on state-of-the-art, decentralized, distributed technology.
Right. Distributed ledger, everything is cool. It's a consensus, everything.
And you don't have to worry about those bad guys that started the last crisis. This system is trustless.
Right. Okay. So I think we agree there's probably a crisis coming.
I would assume so. However, there's so much dry powder. It's like like the AI bubble that came, right? We're in a dip, and all of a sudden we just kept going, and it's like we broke right out and just kept going, and we didn't stop. Nvidia, all these small all these companies are bringing up all the ETFs now, and it's nuts to see, but everything's looking bullish right now.
You got to hand it to it. I mean, you got to hand it to these guys. They are like the Terminator, the second Terminator. I mean, this guy it shakes off some hits, doesn't it? It just keeps going. Like, wow.
Yeah. I thought COVID was it. Like, I really did. I thought that was the end, and that was going to be the time where this all gets ushered in. And apparently I was wrong, but now, the timing of Fink saying everything that he's saying and everybody saying everything they're saying, it seems like better timing now. So maybe I'll be wrong again, and they're able to kick the can down the road again. But at one point, mathematics, it matters, right? Like the amount of debt that you have, everything, and you bring that to the table, eventually something gives. And what does that look like? I don't know, but I don't particularly.
Right. Eventually, mathematics matters, but I there's a tendency to think the sky is falling because everything's now. Twitter is now. Everything is an emergency. It's clickbait here, clickbait there. But you've got a system where 55 or 60% of world assets are dominated in U.S. dollars. This is going to take some time. This transition is going to take some time. It's a lot of money we're talking about here.
Right. So the debt backing tokens, right? You went from a debt-based system to kind of like a credit-based system, right? They can start rolling that stuff out. They have been rolling it out. A lot of the wealth too is illiquid. So if you were able to tokenize it and bring liquidity to some of this stuff, I think what we were talking about earlier about everything getting revalued certainly is in the picture. And at the same time, they start rolling out a different system altogether, and you're going to pretty much have to navigate the environment to hold on to what's yours. And, there's going to be a lot of winners and losers that happen with it. Depends on how you play the game. But, I think it's going to get a lot rockier from here.
I expect some choppy water before too long.
The other thing,
especially because this bank crisis, I'm telling you, is not behind us.
I agree with you 100%. They need an excuse bigger than COVID to print, right? So what would be bigger than COVID to set this off? A war, maybe something like that, some type of war. Are we ready?
The old classics. Just go to your Bible. They're pretty, war, famine, pestilence. I mean, take your pick.
And we're seeing that. So I'm personally in that camp. Cyber warfare would certainly make sense. You see stuff shut down, and all of a sudden we start moving to a different system, and then they start rolling out something completely different. But yeah, you Darren Moore Jr. think
the XRP Ripple? That's keep your eye on that ball.
I am keeping my eye on that ball, but yeah, there's other ones too, though. It's not necessarily an XRP centric system, but what Ripple has done in the past, and the people that are involved with Ripple, those they worked for Larry Fink and moved over. They worked for the think tanks that tell Washington what to do and move to Ripple, right? So there's a lot of overlap. I was told by Doomberg that I shouldn't put so much faith in that, because a lot of career politicians will do that. They'll do the revolving door and look for the biggest check. And Ripple's certainly giving out big checks. So I shouldn't do that, but I am doing that, and I can't help myself. A lot of the infrastructure that's built out is built out on Ethereum too. So XRP guys hate Ethereum, and because there's a double standard between Ethereum and XRP. However, there's a lot of infrastructure that's built on Ethereum as well. So those private systems that I told you about before,
Yeah.
a lot of those are built off of Ethereum technology that just isn't decentralized. It's just a Solidity. It's just Ethereum without it being decentralized. So they've set up a lot of systems like that. And then on top of it now, the Ripple guys have made it so you could take those Ethereum systems and plug them right into the XRP ledger, and they made federated side chains, they call it. So a lot of these CBDCs. So here's another thing that I want to point out. I don't know if you've ever read A Diary of the Economic Hitman, but in that
John
book,
Perkins.
he talks about going out to the disadvantaged countries and enslaving them into debt, right? So one of the countries that is under the U.S. protection is a small country in Asia Pacific, Palau. They've been piloting a digital dollar. They have it on the XRP ledger right now. That's on the XRP ledger. It's not on a clone of the XRP ledger. It's on the XRP ledger. And Palau uses the dollar. They talk closely with the Treasury. They talk closely with the Fed. They're getting guidance from the Fed. I think that is going to be an excuse for Augustin Carstens, for Christine Lagarde to say, look, it works in this country. It's working perfectly here. We should roll it out in a little bit bigger countries and a little bit bigger countries. Not to mention there's a big military base in those regions. So in that region, due to Taiwan and China, there's a big military base. I think the soldiers are usually first tested on, right? So they're issuing dollars over there. They're starting to do this stuff. So I'm starting to see, they're issuing dollars on the XRP ledger. So, if you get a bunch of countries to issue currencies on the ledger, that brings more value to the ledger. And, and it's
right. It's the network effect, right? Sure.
Right.
That's interesting. Right. That's interesting. Anyway, I have a lot, I have so many questions in my mind about where all this is headed. I'll know a lot more once I've really kind of done my due diligence. Right now, I'm just like, my head is just pounded with questions like, what are these guys up to? What are they after? And I think I've got a couple books coming about how crypto relates to central banking. I think it's going to probably clear up a lot of my questions. We'll see.
Well, look what Apple and PayPal, right? The second they issued a stablecoin, the Fed stepped right in, the bank regulator stepped right in. Their official stance is, systemic risk, but they certainly have their interest in crypto CBDCs.
They do. Gary Gensler is a busy beaver, isn't he?
Yeah, but, they intertwine. So the CBDCs, yes, they could work just by themselves, but they wouldn't really work that well by themselves. That's, it's you keep everything in silos, like we were talking about before with the banks. If you were to add crypto with CBDCs, you have the internet. You have the internet of value, and that could happen really quick and everything. So that's something I'm just paying attention to. It's just rolling out bit by bit. You're seeing all the right people doing the right things, the right partners going to the right places. But yeah, you don't know what's going to happen. Anything is up in the air. But I mean, certainly.
Well, I'd bet on more. I'd bet on more inflation over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I am too. Is there anything that we didn't talk to that you want to add? I see we're running out of time.
No, that's really it. I'd be interested in, we need to follow this up down the road, and circle back probably, I'd say during the fall. The fall could get really interesting. So let's just kind of pencil in a follow-up conversation, and I'll know more by then.
Right. October is usually when these things, March, October, those are usually, and right before Christmas. I remember 2017. It was like right before Christmas, an extra, kick in the gut. It's
I think Bernie Madoff was December 8th, 2008, if I remember, 8th or the 10th. Anyway, yeah, you're right. Those are the sweet spots. Maybe we talk after Thanksgiving. How about that?
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get the sign. We'll know when to talk when it's in the headlines. But it was great to have you on the show, John. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming out. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Darren. I'll see you.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon or my ghost site, dmjr.ghost.io.